The early medieval period in India was a distinctive epoch, very different from the early historical and the later medieval periods. In this episode, we shall discuss the social structure of early medieval India. It would be important to see in what ways the distinctive features of the early medieval period were different from the situation prior to 600 AD. According to recent scholars, the hallmark of this epoch lies in the pronounced regional features in almost all aspects of life.
The early medieval phase, spanning from 600 to 1300 AD, has attracted a multiplicity of approaches to its study. We are referring to Medatithi's commentary on Monu, Jimutpahun's Daibhag, Maskarin's commentary on Gautama Dharma Sutra, Bhavaswami's commentary on Naradya Manu Samhita, Bharuchi's Vivarana on Manu, and a very important text, Mitakshara, written by Vignaneshwar, which is a commentary on Yaggavalkya Sriti. Now, it would be interesting to see how these different differences are coming out in these texts. Many times we find that there are contradictions within one text and sometimes a lot of differences appearing between the texts. It is in this backdrop that we would like to take up the study of social structure. There is a proliferation of jatis during this period, and what is very interesting is that you find that there is sometimes a division in some of the texts between two categories, the Dijo, here meaning the twice born or the Brahman, and the Oddijo. Now, Oddijo would actually mean all non-Brahmana groups. Now, it is very interesting that the Brahma Vaivarta Purana of the 14th, 15th century is talking about 102 jatis in the case of Bengal. Now, this proliferation of jatis, how do you explain this proliferation of jatis? And we also find that, many times the jati and the varna, these two terms are being used interchangeably. The lawgivers would like to believe that there were these numerous matrimonial combinations and permutations, and the offsprings who were the outcome of these combinations and permutations, they were getting distinct identities, jati identities of their own. So there was a proliferation of jatis. Now, we could actually see this in terms of recent scholarship. We could actually see this when we look at certain conditions which were prevailing during this time. What is happening during this time? That there was an agrarian expansion into peripheral marginal areas. And you see that many of these Brahmana or elite groups were given land in these marginal tracts. So they were carrying their Varna model, Varna theoretical Varna, Jati Varna model into these peripheral areas where there was the previously existing simpler lineage society. So this was one process. Another thing that we are finding is that many of these occupational groups were getting crystallized into endogamous jatis. And then you're finding the induction of many of the non-indigenous groups, like the Mlechos and some other groups within the social structure. So we have to keep this general background in mind when we are talking about the early medieval society and the proliferation of jati.
Each Varna category will be taken up and their position and status will be highlighted at the same time, underlining the deviation from the traditional Dharmashastric ideas.
Now, the Brahmana enjoyed the highest ritual status in society. We get that picture from the Dharmashastras, basically. They were the most literate group in the society who could interpret the Vedic tradition, the Epico-Puranic tradition, as well as the sectarian Bhakti cult traditions. We find that there was definitely an overwhelming influence of the priestly function, but at the same time we see that there is some divergence from the traditional picture.
Ma'am, I would just like to ask a question, that you have just said that there was modification, at times substitutions from Dharma Shastras, and that there was changes in those Varna systems. Then I would just like to ask you, ma'am, that was there a change in the priestly functionings of the Brahmanas? If there was a change, what was the nature of that change?
Very good question. Now, I was just coming to that we do see that the priestly function was important. You come across evidence from the texts and the inscriptions of elaborate and extravagant forms of worship, the performance of brothos and prashchittos, sometimes related to the prevalent importance of astrology. So all these things were happening, and which is emphasizing the priestly function of these particular social group. But we have to understand the changed scenario. The ruling local lineages who wanted to establish themselves as important foci of power, these so-called rulers, they often lacked the pedigree, and therefore the social group of the priests were called upon to perform these elaborate pujas. Okay, so that way the priestly function was a change definitely from what was happening before, because of the changed scenario. So we see that these rapid rise of ruling lineages in these peripheral areas, that necessitated the calling of these priests, the social groups, who would preside over these pujas. They would uphold these the worship of these family deities, which often became dynastic cults related to some sectarian bhakti cults, and also they were given in fact they took upon this task of fabricating genealogies, which would give some kind of sanction to these ruling lineages looking for pedigree.
The priestly class was far from being a homogeneous community.
Since they were given revenue-free land and villages, as I was just saying, so many of them were turning to rural aristocracy. Many of them were turning to politics and war. Also, we find that among these groups, some of them were in a very depressed condition. Some of them were facing conditions of poverty. And we frequently come across references to Brahmana horse dealer, beetle seller, then artisans, dancers, okay, and people belonging to this community selling wine, clarified butter, and milk. Now, what is interesting is the tenfold classification that we are coming across in Mitakshara, where we can see how this priestly community was perceived by, a text like Mitakshara. We find a tenfold classification of Deva, Muni, Raja, Dijo, Vaishya, Shudra, Marjara, Beast, Mlecho, Chandal. So you can see from this varied classification that how a priestly community was viewed at this time. There is a Rashtrakuta charter of the 10th century AD, which is talking about five groups of the priestly community, like the Saraswat, belonging to the region of the river Saraswati, the Kanyakubja, belonging to the region of Kanauj, Utkala, belonging to the region of Orissa, the Maithala, relating to Mithila, and the Gaura. Now, such classifications based on regional and territorial basis are also seen in different parts of Gujarat and Rajasthan. Another interesting thing, again, when we are talking about heterogeneity, is the increasing number of the Pravaras, the Gotras, the Vamshas, the Pakshas, Anvayas, Ganas, Gamis. Therefore, we have to understand this changing nature of the Brahmanas, changing nature, the heterogeneity of this group in these scenarios. in the backdrop of these processes, because they are giving legitimation to the ruling lineages. At the same time, they are also looking for some kind of sanction. Interestingly, as I had mentioned in the beginning in the introduction, that there are contradictions between the texts. For example, Medatithi, which is a commentary on Monu, a very important text of this time, Medatithi is saying that the Atutai Brahman, one who has murdered someone, he can be free from capital punishment. Even no monetary fines need to be imposed on him. But another text, that is Vijnaneshwar's text, that is saying that no, definitely an Atatai Brahman has to face capital punishment. Okay, and this is an interesting thing that we are seeing in the early medieval period.
The early medieval period was characterized by pronounced regional features in almost all aspects of life. There was an overwhelming influence of the epico-Puranic tradition during this period. It was gradually replacing the Vedic tradition. During the early medieval period, there was a proliferation of jatis that outnumbered the 4 varnas. There was crystallization of occupational groups into endogamous jatis. During this period, much deviation is noticed in the composition of the priestly class, as well as in the scope of its rights and prerogatives.
Ma'am, I have a question. How was the status of the Kshatriyas changing?
Yes, that is what I was actually going to say, that we see that we cannot assess the Kshatriya, this social category, like the Brahmanas, only from the Dharmashastric ideal. We see that the Kshatriya origin is no longer the precondition for establishing a ruling power. Recent scholarship has tried to understand the Rajput phenomenon that we are seeing in Rajputana, and trying to understand this phenomenon in terms of a social and political process whereby several clans and subclans in Rajputana, in their desperate bid to get political power, were looking for legitimation, and they were aspiring to the Rajput status through this legitimation. And many of these clans and subclans, they came from the indigenous background, basically. In the modern version, we might call that a tribal background. And you also find some non-indigenous groups in this background, in this category. Now, what is happening? That we are finding that, again, these people, these clans and subclans, they are aspiring to the Rajput status, and they are looking for some kind of sanction. Here again, the Brahmin priests, the so-called priestly groups, they were coming to their aid. They were fabricating genealogies. So, in fact, if you go through some of the Vangshatalikas of these clans, some of the clans which were becoming important Rajput powers, we find that there is a lot of fabrication of genealogies, many of them claiming descent from the lunar and solar families, and also we find that there is an upholding of the family cult, which was becoming the dynastic cult, often related to the sectarian bhakti cult. So it is in this condition, it is in this way that we have to understand Rajputization, and this was a pan-Indian phenomenon that we are seeing, which can be called Kshatriyization, which can be seen in the rest of India. Also, we find that there is an intimate relationship between the priestly community and the ruling lineage, because the ruling lineage needed sanction from the priestly community, and the priestly community also looked for, revenue, free villages, agrahara land, etc., from the ruling lineage. So there is kind of an intimate relationship. Another way in which these lineages were trying to establish these clans and subclans, I'm saying in the context of Rajputana, they were trying to establish themselves was through marital alliances with the already established political powers. So it is in this way that we can talk about Rajputization or Kshatriyization in the context of early medieval society.
The next group in the social structure that is being discussed here is that of the Vaishyas. Traditionally, they were involved in agriculture, cattle rearing, and trade. During the early medieval period, one comes across numerous occupational jatis involved in diverse crafts and professions without being a part of the Vaishya Varna.
R.S. Sharma, very important historian of this time, is saying that agriculture, the scope of agriculture is no longer restricted only to the Vaishyas, but it is thrown open to the Shudras. Okay, and he is therefore talking about declining economy, declining trade, and therefore he's saying that the Vaishyas also, there was a declining status of the Vaishyas who before were engaged in trade. Now we find scholars like Ranubir Chakraborty, they are not agreeing, they are questioning Sharma's picture of a declining economy, and they are furnishing evidence to the contrary. They are saying that we do get economy wasn't declining, trade wasn't declining. In fact, Ranubir Chakraborty would like to see that in many cases the Vaishya could be identified with the category of the Vanik. Okay?
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
I would like to ask that why are we saying that the Vaishyas were becoming identical with the Vanik?
Okay. Now, actually, this is a view that we are coming across in Ranubir Chakraborty's work, and he is quoting several evidence to support his argument. He's saying that if you look at some of the texts and the inscriptions of this period, they are talking about the establishment of vanigrams, that is, settlements for the traders during this period by the ruling powers. Also, he is quoting some evidence from Medatithi's commentary on Monu, where the text is laying out certain qualifications that a Vaishya should have. Now, what are these qualifications? These qualifications are that the Vaishya should know his region very intimately. He should know about the products which are found in that region, and he should be aware of the customs and regulations pertaining to that region. All these qualifications are those that of a Vanik. Now, another thing that we are finding during this period is that you are coming across accounts of very prestigious merchant families, very wealthy merchants settling in different parts, especially in Gujarat, Rajputana area, and we are getting these accounts of narratives of their, of their immense wealth, about the fact that, they were also donating to donating to works of charity and welfare, and that they were often engaging in marital alliances with established families. On the basis of all this, Ranubir Chakraborty is arguing that these merchant families were trying to establish themselves. They were trying to establish themselves as prestigious lineages. And we are getting several references in the Jain texts. Okay? In the case of Vaishya, we have to understand this in terms of the jati status of the community, not the theoretical Varna status.
The texts upholding the traditional Brahmanical social order appear to have an obvious bias against the Sudras. But often, these texts had contradictions too.
Basically, we have to think of the Shudras of the early medieval period as a vast heterogeneous community, a vast heterogeneous community of agricultural laborers, of petty peasants, artisans, some craftsmen, servants, attendants, etc., etc. And we are getting references to these, swelling ranks of the Shudras in Brahma Vaivarta Purana, in Abhidhana Chintamani, in Vaijayanti, to mention some of the more important texts. R.S. Sharma is saying that we have to look at this essentially in terms of three overlapping processes. One, again, the expansion of settlements, agrarian settlements, extension of the Brahmanical social order in the peripheral areas, where we are finding many of these groups like the Bhillas, the Pulindas, okay, the Shabars, okay, they are getting incorporated within the Brahmanical social order. Then Sharma is talking about two other processes, that is the crystallization of many of the occupational groups as jatis, transformation of the craft guilds into endogamous jatis, like the Napita, Modoka, Tambulika, Sharnakara, Shudrakara, etc., etc. And also the rise of various sectarian bhakti cults. Now we have to look at the heterogeneity of the Shudras and the changes in the nature of this community in this perspective. Now we have to keep one thing in mind, that the Shudras, when I'm talking about heterogeneous, this would mean that there were these innumerable, it was basically an agglomeration of numerous occupational jatis. So it is actually very difficult to talk about precisely about their nature. If we look at the divisions in some of the Shudras on the basis of purity or impurity of their professions and conduct, then the Shudras were divided into the Shot Shudras and Ashat Shudras. Then there's another division called the Bhojanya and Abhojanya Shudras, which means Bhojanya means those groups who could cook food which could be eaten by the Brahmanas. And Abhojanya, basically the Brahmanas could not eat food prepared by these groups. Then many of these Shudras, we find several subcastes of these Shudras. Subcastes in terms of different regional affiliations, regional characteristics. Also, many of these subcastes were related to specific processes of the industrial work. So we find again what the heterogeneity, and what is important is the jati status of many of these groups. Now the next group that we would like to take up is the Kayasthas. We see that the Kayasthas, sometimes synonymous with the coroner, were basically a professional group of scribes and writers, and we do come across this group from the early historical times.
The Kayasthas assumed the characteristics of a jati during the early medieval period.
A professional group was needed who would maintain records of these land and villages, maintain records of increasing items of revenue, and would keep drafts of all these land assignments. And when there was already a class of scribes, professional class of scribes existing, what was happening during this period? Because of the needs of the time, they were slowly assuming jati-like characteristics. By the end of the early medieval period, they were emerging as the most important group, non-Brahmana group. What was happening, therefore, that in many of the texts you have references to Kayasthas as oppressors. Similarly, if we look at the group of the Ambasthas or the Vaisyas, there was always a stigma associated with the medical profession, with this class. But we see in the early medieval period this was changing. Why this was changing? In the mathas and even in the Buddhist viharas, you're coming across medical establishments like the Arogya Shalas. So this and the fact that the study of medicine was becoming important in these institutions helped to remove this stigma from the Ambasthas or the Vaisyas.
The notion and practice of untouchability reached its nadir during this period.
Untouchable groups refer to the the groups which were performing these menial tasks and groups which were performing these so-called unclean services. They were called the Antajas, occupying the lowest rung in society. Apart from these Antaja groups, we also come across certain groups like the Chandal, the Hadi, the Dome, who were facing even worse conditions than these Antaja groups. So they were facing a worse kind of, perhaps the worst social ostracization.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I would just like to ask a question that untouchability as a practice did exist in the earlier periods, but why did it reach to such a height during this period?
Maybe one can explain this in this way, that perhaps this exposes some kind of an insecurity among the lawgivers, their inability to cope with the situation where you're getting so many aboriginal converts and offsprings from miscegenation. So, when the reality was like that, they were trying to uphold the Brahmanical social order by being obsessed about purity and pollution.
Any discussion on the social structure of the early medieval period would be incomplete without mentioning the Aranya, a separate space beyond the purview of the state society.
This was a space inhabited by the renouncer, by the exiled, by the wild beast and its tamer, and various indigenous groups. You find many of these descriptions of these nomadic hunter-gatherers who were inhabiting these, this space. They were outside the purview of state society, but they could form a very important loyal support plank to the state society. So it is with this that we would like to end our class on the early medieval social structure. I have tried to bring out the complexities in understanding the social structure of this period.
The early medieval period was characterized by pronounced regional features in almost all aspects of life. There was an overwhelming influence of the epico-Puranic tradition during this period. It was gradually replacing the Vedic tradition. During the early medieval period, there was a proliferation of jatis that outnumbered the 4 varnas. There was crystallization of occupational groups into endogamous jatis. During this period, much deviation is noticed in the composition of the priestly class, as well as in the scope of its rights and prerogatives. During the early medieval period, it was difficult to think of an ideal Kshatriya Varna as given in the Dharma Shastras. A Kshatriya origin was no longer a precondition for establishing a ruling power. The Shastric ideal of a Vaishya Varna performing agriculture, cattle rearing and trade no longer agrees with the early medieval situation. There were numerous occupational jatis involved in diverse crafts and professions. The Sudras were a vast heterogeneous community. The texts are beset with contradictions vis-à-vis the social attitude towards this group. When Kayasthas became coherent and compact groups, they began to be known as jatis and acquired the characteristics of caste groups. The notion and practice of untouchability reached its nadir during this period.